In this video, we'll take a look at the Heathkit DX-20 amateur radio transmitter. The DX-20 was an amateur radio transmitter sold by the Heathkit company from 1956 to 1960. It was offered as a kit of all parts that the user would assemble using the provided instructions. It typically sold for US $35.95, equivalent to almost $400 today. The successor to the earlier AT-1, it was one of the most successful transmitters Heathkit ever made. At the same time period, Heath offered the more expensive DX-35, which also offered AM phone or voice operation. In 1961, the DX-20 was succeeded by the HX-11, which was almost identical, the only differences being styling, an updated meter, the addition of a low-pass filter, switched power output to a TR relay, and a fuse. The basic features of the DX-20 are the following: CW or Morse code operation, RF input power of approximately 50 watts, Pi network coaxial output coupling that could match load impedances from 50 to 1000 ohms, crystal control or operation with an external VFO, support for the 80, 40, 20, 15, 11, and 10 meter ham bands of the time, circuitry using 3 vacuum tubes, a 5U4GB rectifier, 6 CL6 oscillator, and 6 DQ6A final amplifier. Power requirements were stated as 117 volts AC, 60 cycles, 160 watts. The cabinet size is 13 inches wide by 8.5 inches high and 7 inches deep. And the net weight is 16 pounds and shipping weight of 18 pounds. Note that at the time, transmitter power was rated as DC power input, the final plate voltage times current. Most amateur radio licenses specified the maximum input power allowed. For example, US novice class licenses were limited to 75 watts. The actual RF output power to the feed line and antenna is less than the DC input power. The DX-20 used crystal control but would work with a suitable external VFO such as the Heathkit VF1, but needed a small modification to do so. It didn't provide power to a VFO, so a unit like the VF1 would need its own power supply. It supported the 6 HF ham bands of the time, 80, 40, 20, 15, 11, and 10 meters. Note that 11 meters is no longer a ham band. It became the Citizens band in the late 1950s. The transmitter should also support the modern 12, 17, and 30 meter bands. Let's look at the front panel controls. I'll go into more details on the tuning and operation procedure later during the demonstration. The on-off switch controls power to the unit. The transmit standby switch turns on the high voltage power supply when in the transmit position and leaves just the tube heaters powered in the standby position. The operate tune switch selects between full operation and tuning mode where the oscillator is active but the final amplifier is not. At bottom right marked key is a 1/4 inch phone jack for the Morse code key. When no plug is inserted, the key contacts are shorted. At the top is a meter which shows either final amplifier tube grid or plate current depending on the position of the grid plate switch below it. The upper range from 0 to 150 is plate current and the lower from 0 to 6 is grid current, both in milliamps. The large oscillator knob is used for tuning the oscillator stage for adjusting grid current. The switch in the middle is the band selector, selecting which band to use. The 10 and 11 meter bands use the same switch position. The large amplifier knob is used for tuning the final amplifier to resonance. The loading knob adjusts the final amplifier loading or match to the antenna. On the rear panel is the power cord, SO239 UHF connector for transmitter output, and a ground terminal. At the left is an access cover for the crystal socket. As I'll explain later, this cover is not original. A VFO would also connect here if used. The top and sides have some ventilation holes for cooling, and the bottom has 4 rubber feet. I should mention that while there are hazardous voltages inside any piece of line-operated equipment, working inside a transmitter is a little more dangerous than a typical radio receiver, for example. Voltages over 500 volts DC and radio frequency signals which can cause burns are present. Also, an amateur radio license is required to operate or technically even possess a radio transmitter such as this one. Looking inside, it's pretty simple with only 3 tubes. It uses a metal chassis with point-to-point wiring with terminal strips, tube sockets, and other components. Major components on the top include rectifier, amplifier, and oscillator tubes, power transformer, filter choke, variable capacitors for final amplifier and oscillator tuning, tapped coils for output pi network and oscillator, meter, band switch, crystal socket, accessible through an opening in the case. The final tube is shielded by aluminum and mounted at a right angle to the oscillator tube. Underneath the chassis are power supply, filter capacitors and resistors, loading capacitor, and some additional components. Note that this was a kit. The approximately 45-page manual described clearly how to assemble and operate the unit in a way that was well within the skill level of most beginning ham radio operators. Let's go over the operating procedure. One other safety note. As was common with transmitters of this type, when operating there's a significant voltage across the code key. I measured 158 volts DC and a current of over 100 milliamps across the contacts. This is enough to give a shock, potentially even a life-threatening one if held for more than about 3 seconds. Operators of the unit were likely well aware of this fact through direct experience. Note that when testing the transmitter it needs to be connected to a load, either a suitable antenna or preferably a dummy load, as I will be doing here. Back in the day it was common to use an incandescent light bulb as an inexpensive dummy load. The manual suggests using a 40-watt bulb. This had the additional benefit that you can see the RF output level change with bulb brightness. The transmitter was normally crystal controlled with a suitable crystal installed in the socket behind the access panel. Depending on the band, you could use various crystals operating at either the fundamental frequency or a harmonic. The valid combinations were on 80 meters, an 80 meter or 160 meter crystal, on 40 meters, a 40 meter or 80 meter crystal, on 20 meters, a 40 meter or 80 meter crystal, on 15 meters, a 40 meter crystal. On 11 meters, which is no longer a ham band today, you used a crystal of approximately 6.75 megahertz, which would multiply by 4 to get the correct frequency around 27 megahertz. And on 10 meters, a 40 meter crystal. The crystal socket accepts the large FT243 type. More modern crystals are usually in smaller HC49 and HC18 packages with wire leads. To allow using modern crystals, I designed and 3D printed an FT243 size case which uses 2 tube pins and allows a small crystal to be soldered inside. The tune-up procedure, while more complex than with modern transmitters or transceivers, is pretty typical of equipment of the era. Step 1, connect an antenna or dummy load, suitable crystal, and key. Here I'm using an MFJ 949E antenna tuner which has a dummy load and power meter. I'm using an old 7.055 MHz crystal which is in the 40 meter band and a hand key. Step 2, set the selected band, in this case 40 meters. Step 3, set the transmit standby switch to standby. Step 4, set the tune operate switch to tune. Step 5, set the grid plate switch to grid. Step 6, set the on-off switch to on and allow about 1 minute for the tubes to warm up. Set the mode switch to transmit, and with the key down adjust the oscillator tuning for a grid current meter reading of about 2 milliamps or 4 to 5 milliamps on the 10 and 11 meter bands. Set the loading capacitor to 0. Set the grid plate switch to the plate position and tune operate to operate. Key the transmitter and adjust the amplifier tuning capacitor for a dip or minimum. Now gradually increase the loading control clockwise and readjust the amplifier tuning for a dip. Note that the iron vein meter bounces a lot. My AT1 has a similar meter. Later Heathkit switched to a better Darson valve movement as found on modern meters. Step 12, repeat the previous step until the plate current is close to 120 milliamps, corresponding to 50 watts of input power. Note that you'll need to readjust the loading and amplifier controls whenever the frequency is changed. Even though we're using a dummy load, we can hear the transmitter on a nearby shortwave radio set near 7.055 MHz and in single sideband CW mode. On the watt meter, I'm seeing about 22 watts of RF output power. In my testing, I could get 35 watts out on 80 meters and about 15 watts out on the highest frequency 10 meter band. And for fun, here's the unit driving a 60 watt light bulb as a dummy load. I bought this unit in January of 2025 from a local eBay seller in Ottawa, Canada. He had powered it on and seen tubes light up inside, but other than that had no information on its condition. It didn't come with a manual. It was in cosmetically good condition, particularly for being at least 65 years old. It has an original meter, which is somewhat rare to see on these units. The crystal cover was missing, which is very common, as well as the rubber feet. The dial pointer was loose on the amplifier knob, but was easily glued. The line cord looked original and was quite worn. Looking inside, all parts appeared to be present and original, and no obvious modifications had been made. I found some copies of the full manual. All copies on the internet appear to derive from the same original, as they all have the same pencil markings on them. I did a basic cleaning of the front panel and knobs. I noticed that there was a wire jumper across the RF choke in the oscillator circuit. This is a modification that's needed if the unit is used with a VFO. There are also plus and minus markings on the crystal socket to indicate polarity. These would indicate that the unit had been used with a VFO in the past. I replaced the old line cord with a new 2-wire polarized cord. I added rubber adhesive feet to replace those that were missing. I checked that the power transformer windings were good and not shorted or open. After that, I powered it up slowly with a variac, checked that the tube filaments lit up and power supply voltages looked correct. With a crystal and dummy load connected, a quick check showed that it was producing RF output, a good sign, although the grid current as measured by the meter looked a little lower than expected. Some of the switches were intermittent, so I used contact cleaner to clean them. I checked the resistors and capacitors. The capacitors, including electrolytics, tested good, so I decided to keep them, at least for now. Most carbon resistors had gone up in value, but only 2 were enough out of spec to warrant replacing them. The 2 in the oscillator section were replaced, and after doing that I saw that the grid current reading was much more in line with what I expected. 2 precision resistors used in the meter circuit were still within 1% of the correct value, which is fortunate as they're hard to find replacements for. I noticed that the final amplifier tube in my unit is a 6DQ6B tube rather than the 6DQ6A, and it says made in Canada. This indicates that it was replaced at some point. The B version of the tube is a suitable replacement and in fact is rated at a higher plate current, 150 milliamps versus 125 milliamps, and higher plate voltage, 800 volts versus 700 volts. As line voltages in North America today, typically 120 volts and often a little more, are higher than the 117 volts that was common when the unit was built, the B version of the tube should better handle that and maybe also allow a little more power output. I tested output on all bands with various crystals and confirmed that the power output was reasonable. I found that on 80 meters I couldn't get the plate current to dip below 150 milliamps, but a reference on the web indicated that this is normal. The signal looked good on an oscilloscope and sounded clean when received on my Yaesu F2450D ham radio. I was also able to load it into a real antenna, my shortened dipole on the 40 meter band, although I didn't try to make a contact. I looked at some options for replacement of the crystal cover. The original cover was a 2-inch metal grommet that fit into the opening and was attached to a large plastic knob like those on the front panel. I wasn't able to find a metal hole cover of that size, but I just happened to have a plastic plug intended for covering the umbrella hole in a patio table. It fit the 2-inch hole perfectly. While not metal and offering shielding, it works, and I might even add a 3D printed Heathkit knob replica to make it closer to the original. This unit's in very good condition and now works as new. I hope to try it out on the air. As I only have maybe one crystal with a suitable frequency, I may try hooking it up to my Heathkit VF1 VFO, although it will need some type of power supply as it can't be powered by the DX-20. There are some designs online. Another requirement will be a transmit-receive switch. I could use the one I have with my DX60B transmitter. The DX20 was a very basic CW transmitter, but was affordable and reliable, and Heathkit sold many of them, possibly more than any other transmitter. Many hams of the 60s and 70s used one as their first transmitter. The main limitation was crystal control, but adding a VFO was a common upgrade. Units are still being used on the air today, mostly for nostalgia reasons.